had the latest inflation figures this morning. They had gone down to 2%. And we did speak to certain people, I think, including Jeremy Hunt, who was taking some credit for that. But now things taking a nudge back up. Is that down to the Conservatives as well?
Well, look, the path of inflation is not a sort of nice, neat, linear line. So I think a sort of small uptick to 2.2 from 2, the market was expecting 2.3, largely due to baseline effects around the way in which energy prices have moved today compared to about a year ago, is not a cause for alarm bells to be ringing. Although having said that, I think what is concerning is what is actually happening on the services element of inflation, which fell from 5.7 to 5.2%, which was welcome, but is still high. And within that, you've got wage inflation. Now, what this government has done is stepped in and very promptly has started paying out lots of fairly hefty wage increases, including the junior doctors at 22%, without any commensurate requirement for productivity improvements to go alongside that. And my fear would be that this in itself may drive that services component of inflation, which is something that the Bank of England is looking very closely at. Now, the implications of that could be inflation higher and longer than expected, and of course interest rates therefore perhaps having to stay higher for longer, with knock-on effects with mortgage holders and businesses and so on. So I don't think we're entirely out of the woods. It's in the government's hands, and I think there are flashing red lights around the approach that they're taking to pay in the economy.
Now, this is a genuine question, but can you remind me, under the Conservatives, especially in the last 2 years or so where we had problems with inflation, what the service component, how did that fare?
So that has sort of moved around as it would do, as you'd expect. I mean, I can't set out every sort of month-by-month figure over the last few years. Let's frame it. So back in the autumn of 2022, inflation was up at over 11%. And the great achievement of the last government was to get this down now to target to 2%. In fact, if you look at the OBR forecast going forward, we will actually see it go below that 2% mark in 2025.
I seem to remember the services element being quite high.
Yes. So look, it's part of the challenge. So we came out of COVID. One of the consequences of that was bottlenecks in supply chains and an inflationary push. We then had the Ukraine war with energy prices spiking, and we imported a lot of inflation that way. A wage price spiral, which drives into service inflation, was a concern, and indeed has been part of what the Bank of England through monetary policies had to get on top of. But my overall point would be that we've gone from a situation in October, November of 22, where it was, I think, 11.1% or thereabouts, to getting it down broadly to target. And that is a Conservative achievement in the last government, but I do think that this government is putting that at risk by its approach to public sector pay, because that'll have knock-on consequences now, these settlements, for others that are coming forward when it comes to pay negotiations. And if you get those pushes on wages, you'll get inflation.
Strikes also affect the economy.
Yes, they do, and that's why economics and government policy is always a balancing act. But I think in the round, the big dragon that has had to be slayed, that was visited upon us through external factors, not created by the last government, by external factors, has been brought under control. And the danger is, if it gets sticky, and it gets more difficult to get down, or it starts to take off again, then you have to take fairly prompt action on interest rates to bring it down. And that, of course, is not good for the economy and not good for mortgage holders. And that's the risk this government is taking.
There are a few other issues on your brief, really. If you look at the front of the Telegraph this morning, number of parents claiming disability benefits for children with conditions like autism and ADHD has risen by 200,000 since lockdown. You were very recently doing this job in government. How much of a problem is this?
So economic inactivity, which is the area that this faces into, is an issue in our country. Overall, economic activity is lower than it was under every year under the last Labour government, and it's below the average across the EU and the OECD and the G7 and so on.
But it has been a sticky problem, hasn't
it?
You were on this
what I was going to go on to say, what I was going to go on to accept is that, but when it comes to sickness and disability benefits, the story is different, and there is an issue particularly actually around mental health, and particularly around younger people. Now that's why when I was the Secretary of State and in government, I brought in fundamental reforms around something called the Work Capability Assessment, which is the gateway into these benefits, to put the emphasis on helping people, particularly into employment, rather than consigning them to going on to benefits for the very long term. And what the OBR said was that would reduce the numbers going on to those benefits by over 400,000 people. So there are things you can do. But it takes a bit of time and it takes a lot of political will. My concern is that this government has said absolutely nothing about the reforms that I brought through. And if they do absolutely nothing, then the costs, for example, to the taxpayer are going to continue to spiral ever upwards. Now, in the context of the kind of public finance pressures that we all know that we have, and there's talk about tax rises and what's coming up in the budget, it would be a complete dereliction of duty for this government to simply ignore these things. And at the moment, they are eerily silent on them.
But what exactly? I still don't quite understand, because this is something that we have, as I said, we've talked about for years, it feels like, and clearly it's an important problem. But I still don't quite understand, unless you impose some kind of, I don't know, incentives or penalties, how do you get people who say they're not available to work to be available?
Okay, so if you take the component that is, for example, related to mental health, what you need to do is at the earliest part of what is otherwise a journey into long-term benefits, get the help in. So what we announced in our last budget was hundreds of thousands of additional talking therapies within the NHS. Now, these are very effective. The second thing that I did was I created something called WorkWell. So instead of 100,000 people falling out of the workforce every year, starting with a sick note from their GP and just getting signed off, and that starts the journey into those long-term benefits, actually getting people into something called WorkWell, which I set up, which brings employment support, mental health support and other support together to make sure that people are able to stay in work, where we know incidentally it's very good for people's mental health. The other thing that I brought in was something called universal support, which is where, for those who find it most challenging to get work, having a one-to-one mentor for a period of a year to help them get into work, and critically to stay into work. So there are many things that you can do, but as I say, the critical thing is we brought in fundamental reforms that are driving these numbers in the right direction. Well, Labour have said nothing about it.
Okay, as just a couple of other issues. The most important one, I suppose, for you anyway, is that you are one of 6 people who want to become the next Tory leader, and you're very invested in that, obviously. And I know that people who've been polled are not going to decide this, but how do you feel about the fact that 3 in 5 British people polled don't care who becomes the next Conservative leader?
Well, the way I feel is, in a sense, not a huge amount of surprise, because I think, we have been a party that has been fighting itself and been introspective in a way that most people from the outside would have found pretty selfish. We did some great things when we were in government, absolutely great things, but there are areas where we failed to deliver. And so we have a lot of work to do now to unite our party and to come forward with the right policy platform to reach out both to those that were drawn by reform, but also never to forget that we lost people to Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And now we've got 5 years, basically, in order to assess that policy platform and to get that right. So look, what's happening at the moment is that we've got to rebuild our party, and we've got to get a hearing with the British electorate, and we're going to do that through unity, and we're going to do that through a lot of listening and a lot of hard work and working out the answer to a lot of fundamental and difficult questions, including, for example, the fact that the average Conservative voter is age 63. That is completely untenable. It is not something that you can solve by leaping on some magical ideological square. It is something you solve through deep, hard work over a sustained period of time. Okay. And I believe that I understand that, and I'm the right person to take that forward.
Right. One of your opponents, Tom Tugendhat, says that Elon Musk is delusional. Now, Elon Musk, as you know, has been very interested in British politics in the past fortnight, almost obsessive. Do you think he's helping or hindering the debate in this country?
Elon Musk.
Yes.
So I am worried.
Not Tom Tugendhat.
No, I think Tom is a fellow Conservative, absolutely. Okay, right. I think Elon Musk. Look, I think his comments about us sending people to the Falklands, who've been rioting, which was untrue, and his comments suggesting that we're on the brink of a civil war in this country is absurd and deeply, deeply unhelpful. I have concerns about X generally in terms of the fairly permissive permissive approach, should I say, to those that are able to further all sorts of views, including conspiracy theories, etc., on that platform. And I do think that one of the takeaways from the very, very unfortunate incidents that have happened in recent days and weeks is that we do need to look afresh at social media in terms of policing content, in terms of consequence for those platform providers that allow some of these ideas to percolate, because they do have real world consequences, as we saw in our streets.
Well, I was going to say that. So finally, I mean, you want to get your message across. It's a platform for people like you, for politicians. You want to be elected. You want to be chosen as Conservative leader. It's a valuable platform for you. But at the same time, as you say, you're kind of swirling around and you're inhabiting a place where conspiracy theories and pretty horrendous stuff is going on, and it's being enabled, some people would say, by Elon Musk. Therefore, is it in your mind at all to come off X?
Me personally, no, certainly not at the moment. I know some fellow colleagues across the House actually have been debating that, and I think some of them might have actually done that. In my case, I will stay on the site, but I do think we do need to have a long, careful, measured look at the way in which sites like X are feeding into issues like conspiracy theories, misinformation, and violence on our streets. Now, obviously, the online safety bill has been passed, although the actual teeth of that don't bite until next year. So it's a slightly sort of moving terrain in that sense. But we do certainly need to look very carefully, I think, about the role that these platforms are playing in what's been happening.
Mel Stride, thank you very much. He is the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary.
Zara, what do you think of his answer? Has he got it right that it's all about reconnection?
Well, I think he was certainly right to say, I mean, he said it was untenable that the average Conservative voter is 63 years old this morning on Times Radio. It's certainly very difficult for the party that they do seem to have a support base that is geared more strongly towards older voters, and they are really struggling and have done in recent years to appeal to younger cohorts. So I think that was an interesting thing for him to say. He didn't really set out that much about the specifics of what the party should do to widen its support base. And indeed, I went to hear Tom Tugendhat, another of those contenders for the Tory leadership, speak yesterday in central London. And there was a lot on the diagnosis, and he was not really drawn on the specifics beyond a few measures of what he would actually do at this point. And one of the reasons why people have been pushing for a longer Conservative contest is to try and have time to spell out what they think these solutions might be. I think at the moment we haven't had that many specifics from these candidates, and Mel Stride is included as one of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that Mel Stride is a household name, even though he's aspiring to be Tory leader and potential Prime Minister. Tell us more about him. I mean, who is this man, Mel Stride?
Yeah, so some were surprised when Mel Stride threw his hat in the ring, in part because he is known as a very loyal Sunakite. He was the Work and Pensions Secretary under Rishi Sunak since October 2022 up until the most recent general election. And indeed, he was one of the most loyal supporters of Sunak and actually heavily involved in his first unsuccessful and then latterly more successful leadership contest. And even in the election campaign, some of your listeners will know, because even though they know he's not a household name, they probably have heard him speaking at some time or another. He was probably the most familiar face during the election when it came to speaking for the Conservative Party, and there weren't that many of those who were out on the airwaves and trusted really day to day to say the Conservative message with great loyalty, and he was one of those. So some were surprised that he's thrown his hat in the ring, in part because obviously the party is reeling from a big defeat of that government, and many arguing they need to take a different direction. One of the reasons why I think he's interesting and not to be discounted completely is because listening to him on Times Radio this morning, he was good on the economy in the way that he was robust about some of the areas he feels Labour could be weak on, even though inflation was much higher under Conservative governments. He was able to talk about the pay packages given to public sector workers as examples of where we might be nervous about Labour and the economy, perhaps. But he was also interesting on welfare, and this is an issue which the Conservative Party had much to say, and actually something Mel Stride was a very well-known face on, really. He pushed Jeremy Hunt to make this kind of front and centre of numeral fiscal moments. And indeed, it's something that Labour haven't yet really alighted on their proper and final policy package on in any meaningful sense. In fact, it's actually an area where there are some key divisions in Labour. Alan Milburn, a former Labour Health Secretary, has talked about possibly imposing conditions on sickness benefits. That's something Liz Kendall, who was stood beside him at this report launch, didn't endorse herself. She is the Work and Pensions Secretary presently. And so I think for Stride to be talking about welfare at the moment, when we know that the most recent statistics show record numbers who are claiming these sickness benefits, is quite an interesting candidate for that reason. But I should say he probably isn't a front runner, it's fair to say, in the current crop of those 6 candidates running, but he's certainly, I think, not worth discounting completely entirely.
I mean, it strikes me that he is probably, in my experience, the nicest and most normal of the 6 candidates, but that's not necessarily a qualification for leadership, is it?
No, and I think when you look at the Shadow Cabinet League table on Conservative Home, the most recent of these on net satisfaction, he comes ever so slightly further behind Kemi Badenoch and James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat actually as the other candidates. So he's not as popular as those around him on the Shadow Cabinet table, with Conservative activists who, of course, have the deciding hand in this context. But he is, I think, as you're right to say, he has, I think, quite wider appeal in particularly the One Nation wing of Conservative MPs. He's known to be popular among the more kind of centrist and moderate wing. Whether or not he can command their support more than perhaps Tom Tugendhat, I think remains to be seen. I think listening to Tugendhat yesterday, as I did, he was clearly at pains to be widening his support among those not in the One Nation group, i.e. more on the right of the party. Whether or not that actually alienates some on that One Nation wing, many of whom haven't declared who they are going to support yet, I think is quite interesting. And if there is a gap there and Mel Stride can enter it, let's see whether or not he's able to drum up necessary support.
Lara Spirit of the Times, thank you very much indeed. And that's today's What's the Tory? Mel Stride.